here. We would love for you to consider doing the same with us. If you've been paying attention over the last couple of months, we've been talking a lot about Bible classes and things like that. Rob had a meeting for us just last Sunday afternoon where we were talking about the Bible classes that we provide for both adults and primarily kids here at Twin Creeks. And it just made me think about Psalm 78. Because in Psalm 78, Asaph had some things to say to the children of Israel about teaching the next generation. And so what I'd like to do this morning is to just do an expository study on the first 8 verses of Psalm 78 and to think through how do you teach children to trust in the Lord? How do you raise children that are confident in God? And I think Asaph has some things that are helpful for us there. So if you would, please turn over to Psalm 78, and we're going to look at the first 8 verses there. What I'd like to do is to read those verses and then take our time down through them. So starting in verse 1, I'll be reading from the ESV. This is a maskil of Asaph. Asaph was one of the hymn writers that was associated with David, King David. And he writes, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God." Now, the rest of the psalm, this is just really the introduction to the psalm. The psalm is much longer, but what Asaph proceeds to do with the rest of it is to give them a history lesson of Israel's relationship with God and how that relationship was cyclical, where God would deliver them and rescue them and give them instruction, and they'd be faithful for a while, but then they would forget. So like in verse 11, they forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown them. And when a generation came along that forgot the Lord and what he had done and what he had said, then things would go badly until they repented and came back around. So the verses that we just read are really the introduction. And there's a reason, I think, that Asaph is so fixated on instructing children. I mean, so many educators throughout the generations have recognized how formative kids are when they're little, and how you can teach them and train them, and some of the things that they learn when they're tiny, they can recall when they're old. You know, you have folks that talk about, give me a child for the first 7 years, and you may do what you like with them after that. His point is, if I can train a child for the first 7 years of his life, I can make such an impact on him, it doesn't matter what happens after age 7. There's a lot of truth to that. It's not absolute, but there's a lot of truth to that. Someone said, as the twig is bent, so the tree inclines. You've got these plants that you can train and tie off, and if you keep them there long enough, the longer they go, that's kind of just the direction they're going to kind of want to go. Right? Maybe a silly example was when the church in Birmingham, Alabama was asking me to move down and consider working with them. One of the elders picked me up from the airport, and we had to stop someplace. They had a get-together planned, and so he took me to Sam's Club, and we went through Sam's, and we got to the exit where you're going out and you're showing people your receipt, and as we hit the exit, the guy checking the receipt had stopped another family, and there was a toddler in the cart. And the elder looked at this toddler and got his attention and said, "War Eagle." And that little kid went, "War Eagle!" And I was like, what just happened? And as we walked into the parking lot, I was like, "Did you know that kid?" And he's like, "I knew enough." Because he was wearing a shirt that let me know that he rooted for Auburn, and his parents are bringing him up right. And I thought, what kind of Twilight Zone did I just come and visit? Alabama football. And all of those folks, like that kid doesn't know anything about Auburn. That kid has probably never been to the stadium. He can't even say a name of the player on the team, but he knows that his family roots for Auburn. And that if he says anything about that other team that bleeds red, he's going to be cut off. Right? Now, we have the same thing in all of our families. There was a time when Keenan, our oldest, we were at home, and he must have been about 4 or 5 years old, and he picked up a toy phone and for some reason was wandering around the house talking as he was wandering around the house, and I was like, why is he doing that? And Anna looked at me and she was like, really? And I was like, oh, just a second, I'm taking a phone call. And I started wandering around the house, right? Our kids are impressionable. And whether we intend to or not, whether we're intentional or not, they will learn things from us. They're going to learn things from everybody. And what Asaph is saying here in Psalm 78 in the first 8 verses is he's commanding the Israelites to be intentional in what they teach their kids. Really, what he's saying is you have an opportunity here. And so look at verse 1. Asaph says, give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. He's really getting their attention. This is important. And when he says give ear, he's not saying, hey, just listen to this. You know, there are some things that I will do just to kill time, just to keep myself awake, or even just to give myself some white noise. I'll turn things on my AirPods, and it's just making a noise in my ear. You know, it means I'm not in a quiet room. I remember when I moved into my first apartment at 18, after living in a house with 6 kids and 2 adults, and my room was the hopping place. Like, you would come to my room to play video games or to visit or to read. I had a futon in there. I had a couch in my bedroom. I thought I had made it, right? And you go from a house like that to a single-bedroom apartment with like 400 square feet, and that place was too quiet. And I would turn the TV on just to have noise, right? Asaph is not saying, listen for the sake of hearing noise. That's not what he's talking about. When he says, hear, give ear, O my people, to my teaching, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. He means, I want you to be listening with the intent of responding at the end. I want you to listen with the goal of applying and obeying. Right? That's the kind of hearing that he's asking us to do. And he goes on to say in verse 2, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. You know, it sounds so ominous. Dark sayings from of old. All he's saying is I'm going to share things that have been around for a long time. And they're not mysterious because he says we've known them. But he's about to recount important things. And so really the emphasis is on the people listening. Are you going to listen and hear? To hear these kinds of things. To understand parables, you've got to put some mental energy into it. Think about the parables of Jesus. Jesus taught in parables with the purpose of engaging the hearers, of testing their hearts. Like, to make sense of it, you had to have a spiritually minded heart. And you had to work at it. Some of his parables are easier to understand than others. And so Asaph is like, I'm going to share some things, and you're going to have to put some time in. All right? As he recounts the history lesson, they need to pay attention. I really like verse 4. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generations the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. We will not hide them from their children. We're not going to hold stuff back. We're not going to keep things back. And listen, there are some things in the Bible that are hard to understand. And there are some things in the Bible that are kind of unpleasant to think through and talk about. Actually, some of those things point to the validity of the Bible, because the Bible doesn't sugarcoat Israel's history. It doesn't sugarcoat disobedience. It doesn't try to make you think that the biblical men and women were perfect. It's honest about them, warts and all, which points to its authenticity. This is an accurate record. But it can be hard to think through some of those things with your kids. We have a friend Bunch of kids. They have a bunch of kids. Different state. And the father had a routine of reading the Bible to his kids every night before going to bed. Right? So they'd sit down, and he had the same Bible, and he'd read it to them, and he had done it for so many years that they had cycled through the Bible a couple of times. But he had been intentionally, because of the age of his kids, he had been intentionally skipping over some of the more awkward stories, especially like in Genesis, right? And so finally, his kids were old enough, and he's like, I think they're mature enough where we can talk through this. And so the kids have heard the Bible multiple times. They think they've heard it all. And then their dad finally reads a new chapter, and at the end of it, the whole room is really quiet. And one of the kids was like, Dad, has that always been in there? I'm like, yes. I've never heard that before. But it was something that you had to think through. It took more maturity, right? And the father's point was they have gotten to the age where they can handle this, and I'm not going to hold it back. They need to hear all of it. I'm not going to hide it. So at an age-appropriate level, he was helping them hear things. And that's such an important thing in verse 4. I'm not going to hide things from my kids. You're going to hear it, warts and all. The difficult things is God's people wrestled in obeying him. Now, there's some other interesting things to focus on here. This instruction to teach. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. Do you realize how similar that is to what God through Moses instructed the Israelites to do back in Exodus? Exodus 13:8 says, on that day, talking about the Passover feast, on that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. I mean, the Passover meal was this annual feast, and obviously there was a lot of thanksgiving and joy, but part of the Passover meal was to help them remember the bitterness and the oppression of the Egyptians and the hardness of it, but also the deliverance of God, the mighty words and the works that he spoke and accomplished. And it was primarily within the family that teaching was supposed to take place. The primary responsibility for all of this teaching and instruction is on the parents. Even though the Exodus was a national experience, the whole nation experienced that deliverance, they were supposed to communicate it on an individual level. Tell your son what the Lord did for you. We have a personal salvation story that we need to share with our kids and pass that along to them, right? So let's look at the remaining verses and make 6 notes, 6 points about how we can do this kind of teaching to help children develop confidence and trust in the Lord. How can we instill trust in God? The first thing to notice is this. When you look at verse 4, we're trying to recount how God is preeminent and he's central. Tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. God is the hero of the story. God's the hero of the story. God's the hero of every story. If it weren't for God, nothing would have been created. If it weren't for God, there wouldn't have been a day of rest. If it weren't for God, there wouldn't have been a flood that delivered the earth from wickedness and restarted everything. If it weren't for God, Noah and his family wouldn't have been saved from that flood. If it weren't for God working sovereignly through the life of Joseph, that family would not have been preserved through the famine. And all life wouldn't have been saved. And you can just keep going and marching through the history of the Bible if it weren't for God, if it weren't for God, if it weren't for God. Sometimes I think we get too caught up in our little itty-bitty part of the story. And we like to brag about, well, this was my life and this was blah, blah, blah. It's important to share about your life. As long as you keep things in perspective, your life is meant to glorify the wondrous deeds of God and the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God and the holiness of God and the justice of God. right? So what Asaph is reminding all of these Israelites is as they teach their children about their history, they need to keep God first. Even as families, we want to communicate that with our family. We value every single member of the family. We value every single child. We love all of you, right? But at the end of the day, the goal of this family is to glorify God. And we're going to keep God first. As we make decisions, how do we keep God first? Are we going to keep God first in our schedules? I know we've got all these varying interests and hobbies and sports and all those things. That's great. That's okay. But God's going to come first, which means I'm not skipping church. I'm not skipping Bible class. I remember when I was in my early teens, I had been playing soccer for so many years, and it was just like an open Parks and Rec soccer, like you pay your $50, you get to play. Didn't matter how good you were, you just played. And then finally in my early teens, I got invited to go try out for a tryout team, a travel team. And I was like, I have arrived. Man, I'm the best soccer player ever. I was not the best soccer player ever. But in my head, I thought I was the next Pele, who was really popular at the time. And guess when tryouts were? Sunday morning. And I was like, Dad, I can't, this is my shot. I can't miss it. I've got to go. And he's like, we're going to go. He's like, you're going to go to the second half of tryouts. And I was like, but it starts at 9. And he's like, you can't get there till 11:30. And so I packed my bag and I changed really quick, and we got there and I tried out, and I was like, I've got less time than the rest of the guys had to show off about how good they are, so I've got to go even harder. I've got to prove to them in less time. And by the time I was done, I was convinced that I had secured a spot on the tryout team. And the coach came up to me and was asking me a couple of questions, and he was like, hey, so where were you for the first half? I was like, well, I was at church. He's like, well, we require a lot of commitment out of our players, and if you can only make it to one half of the tryout, what's that going to mean for the rest? And I was like, it was my dad. And about 5 days later, I got my rejection letter. But my dad was 100% right for making me miss. And what he didn't make me miss, he made me present for what I needed to be present for, which was at church, in Bible class, worshiping with God's people, right? So we want to keep God the central figure of our lives and central in the story of the Bible because he is, and we want our kids to realize how incredible he is. The words that are used in verse 4, we're going to tell them the glorious deeds of the Lord, his might, the wonders. That word wonders in the Old Testament is usually associated with the Exodus. You think about the plagues that he sent on Egypt. You think about how he showed up at Sinai. You think about how he parted the sea supernaturally. Those aren't normal things. God showed up, and he showed up in a big way because he's preeminent. Now, he moves on to say in verse 5, God established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children. God didn't just give us a record of his deeds. He did do that. The Bible tells us about the acts of God. But it also is a testimony of the words of God. God didn't just show up and do things. God spoke. And he instructed. And he commanded. And he warned, and he spoke, and there's a testimony, and we have it. We have the record of what God says, and what he wants, and what his desires are, what he loves, and what he doesn't. And it's there. Verse 5 in some of your versions would say, he established a testimony in Jacob, and he appointed a law in Israel. That word law is the Hebrew word for Torah, which means teaching. God taught his people. And we have that teaching. And so if we want to instill confidence in God, we have to share, I love this phrase, we have to share the fixed deposit of God's truth. What that means is, I've got all of it right here. If I want my kids to know what God says, it's right here. All we have to do is open this up and let's figure it out. I don't have to look for anything else. I don't have to go on a treasure hunt. I don't have to wonder. I don't have to guess. God recorded it for us, and he preserved it for us. And there are a lot of folks that have thought that it's trendy to kind of attack the sufficiency of God's word today, to question whether it's reliable, to question whether it's been passed down and it's been done appropriately. And it has. I mean, there are so many great evidences for trusting in the reliability of the transmission of the Word of God. And there are so many books that we can recommend to you about how well that's been preserved, and that's providentially been done. So we want to share with them the fixed deposit. We have what God has meant to communicate to us. And then when you look at verse 5, he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children. We've already made this point, but we as parents need to accept the charge, not just the charge that Asaph has given us here, but every charge in the Bible that emphasizes the role of parents with their kids. That's on us. Our children's formative years are in our hands. You know, that whole, the way a twig is bent is the way the tree is going to grow. Or a little firstborn son walking around pretending he's on the phone and walking the whole time because dad walks the whole time. Like, they are going to catch sometimes more than you instruct. But let's do it both ways. Let's let them catch good things and be instructed in some good things. And God's going to ask us at the end, you know, when we're standing before him and we're parents, he's going to ask us, so how well did you do this? Like, one of the jobs that I gave you was to instruct your kids and teach your kids, to help them know his wonders and his might and that fixed deposit, the law that I gave, the teaching that I gave. Did you pass that along to your kids? This is interesting. Back up to verse 4. We will not hide them from their children. It doesn't say your children. It says their children. The further into this we go, it's going to emphasize the multi-generational aspect of this. Every parent primarily has the role to teach their children. But then as you get the multi-generational thing going, if you're a grandparent, you need to be sharing with your grandkids about your faith in God and your trust in God. You need to be sharing with your grandkids what you've learned about him. If you're an aunt and uncle, you share with your nieces and nephews. You know, this job does not require you to have your own kids, but also to make a difference in the life of children, period. The most important thing that you can share with any child, whether they're biologically yours or not, is to help them come to trust in God. And to share with them what God has done, not just in the Bible, but also in your life. That is such a valuable thing. There's such neat tools out there right now. People have been emphasizing over the last couple of years the idea of preserving the history of your family. And so they have these tools. You know, you can buy these journals or these conversation books where you sit down with older members of your family and it has prompts, you know, where you ask them, depending on their age, you know, what was the most significant event in your life? And you ask your father or your grandfather or your mother or your grandmother, and you record it in this book, and you hang on to the book and you pass it on to your kids. So you're preserving the history of your family. Right? But what if you did something similar, but you did it with their spiritual life? What were the things that made the biggest impact on you spiritually? When did you first realize that you needed to become a Christian? Who was it that taught you the gospel, and how did they do that? Tell me about the first place that you worshiped as an adult. How did you find a God-fearing spouse? Tell me about finding grandma or grandpa. You know, your story, your spiritual story is an important thing to pass along, and it's a part of the larger spiritual story that you're trying to teach. Now, one of the things I appreciate about Asaph here is this next point. We just looked at verse 5. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn. Children need to accept the charge to learn and to know. This is what's so important. This dynamic. This dynamic is true in the circumstance that we're looking at with children and parents, but it's also an important dynamic in any role where you're instructing. You make sure to do your job as best as you can do your job. You try to be as prepared as you can be. You make sure that you've been thorough in your research and that you're being honest with the text, that the text is saying what you're saying it says. You need to be honest about that. And you try to find some methods to engage them, whether it's preaching like this or teaching in a class where there's back and forth, or maybe it's a more informal thing. You do as best as you can do to communicate truth. You speak the truth in love. But at the end of the day, the listener is going to have to make a choice. They're going to have to decide, am I going to put in the effort to understand what's being taught? And am I going to have a humble enough heart to accept it? And am I going to have enough conviction and faith in God that I'm going to follow through and obey? You don't have any control over that. I mean, it's that way right now. You know, I'm trying my best to share accurate information from God's Word, specifically Psalm 78, and try to break it down in a way that is faithful to the text, that makes sense, that communicate it in a way that you'll be able to hear it. But at the end of the day, what you do with it when you walk out of this door, I don't have any control over. It says something about you. And that's the dynamic with parents and kids. And parents, you know, they'll ask, what's the silver bullet to make sure my kids believe? What's the silver bullet to make my kid pray? But your child is going to have to make a decision for themselves about whether they're going to choose faith and trust or not. Right? So, children have to choose whether they're going to know, whether they're going to learn. Right? Have you ever seen the shirt? I almost found a screenshot of this and put it in the PowerPoint. I think Anna found it a couple of years ago, and we quote it in our family a lot, right? And it's the shirt that says, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. I love that shirt. You know, you've got kids that are wrestling with math or whatever. Look, I can explain this 5 different ways, but at some point, you're just going to have to trust me that this means this, and that's the way it works. I can't make it make sense to you. You know, I'll do the very best that I can, but at the end of the day, you've got to do something with it. So children need to accept the charge to learn and to know. And then that leads to something. According to verse 7, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. The goal is having children who place their trust in God. And they're going to have to choose that for themselves. You can't make them choose that. You can't make them choose the timing of that. And that's not what God is going to ask you. He's not going to ask you, did you make your kids trust in me? That's not what he's going to ask. What he's going to ask is, did you faithfully teach them? Did you make sure not to hold anything back? As long as you faithfully did that, then your job is good. Then he's going to turn to your kids and he's going to ask them, okay, did you learn and did you know and then did you hope and trust in me? At the end of the day, that was your call. And let's be really humble and honest about something right here, because I've heard some of this recently and I know I'm going to hear more of it. There is no perfect parent. There is no perfect parent except for God. All of us parents need to be honest about that, and we need to tell our kids that. We don't do it perfect. Every single set of parents is doing the best that, I believe this, they're doing the best they know to do. Right? And their goal is to learn to do it even better over time, but no parent is going to do it perfectly. They're flawed, and they're going to make mistakes. And there are some times where their attitudes need to be adjusted, and they need to work on those and repent of those. But every parent, if they love the Lord and they're trying to follow Jesus, they're doing the best that they know to do. And so for the kids on the other side, what the kids need to do is, if they understand that, because this is what happens typically when you hit 15, 16, 17, 18, and you're like, man, my parents, blah, 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 and my parents this or that. Okay, sure. They've already said it, so take that away. Your parents already said they're not perfect. Take that out of the equation. Have they done anything good and helpful? Have they done anything right? What about their motives? Were they trying to do the best that they could? Well, I guess. Then how about you show them a little bit more of that grace and mercy that you're asking for? Give your parents a break. And realize at the end of the day, they have imperfectly done a job that God has given them to do, and now you're going to have to choose to do what you're going to do with it. Especially the older you get, now it's on you. You're not going to be able to go to God and say, well, my parents could have done it better. He's like, well, I know that. Tell me something I don't know. What'd you do with it? Did you grow? Did you improve? Did you learn? He's going to ask every individual. You can't blame your parents. Right? So there needs to be some grace and mercy shown toward the previous generation as they imperfectly do this. Don't let that become a hang-up for you. At the end of the day, is there some truth in there about God that you need to learn and accept? And if you come to place your trust in God, it will lead to grateful obedience. I think too often we focus on the obedience before the trust. Come to trust in God and in His character and in His might and in who He is. And if your child has that, obedience will follow. Right? The fruit of their trust in God will be grateful obedience. So they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. And then verse 8, he's like, so that they would not make the mistakes of the previous generations. You look at the previous generations of Israelites as they go through those cycles, and there are whole generations where they're characterized by them turning away and rebelling against God. And we want our kids to avoid that. And if we're honest, so parents, if we're honest about some of the things, some of the mistakes that we've made, we can tell our kids, we want you to avoid that mistake. We don't want you to duplicate it. We want life to be better for you as you trust and follow God. Right? So how to instill confidence in God? You do your best at this, and then you're going to have to trust the Lord and see what your kids choose. There is no magic formula or silver bullet to guarantee an outcome when it comes to kids. You're like, I thought I was going to get that. I'm sorry. I can't provide that. Like, I've still got some coming up. I wish I could provide that. But they have to choose. So what does all this mean? As we try to apply these verses, specifically here, I'll just make a couple of suggestions. God has given us an incredible calling to steward. He's called us to teach our kids, and He's called us to try to help them hope in Him and to trust in Him. He's going to ask us, did you faithfully teach? Did you make sure you didn't hold anything back? We have to steward this opportunity really well. And we don't have to fearmonger it. Like, if you go through, of course there are horrible outcomes if your kids don't choose hope in God. And there are horrible outcomes if they choose to disobey God. Like, we get that. But don't let the fear drive you. Let the awe drive you. You have an opportunity to shape little people and, Lord willing, help turn their hearts toward the Lord. Let's take advantage of that window of time the best that we can. And the church here at Twin Creeks has a rich history of teaching young people. Like, you all have been teaching young people for a long time. I mean, really, I'm not that old. Give me 40 years and I probably would have been here and y'all would have been teaching me, but that's just not where I was when I was around. But the congregation is evaluating how we can improve with our teaching. You know, the elders and the congregation, we recently appointed Rob and his focus is going to be on the teaching program here at Twin Creeks. He had a meeting just this last Sunday to talk about some things that we can potentially improve on. I'm sure the elders and Rob are going to be soliciting information from us as we kind of wrap out the year and some things to share with us. As a congregation, let's really take on this challenge to support families as they try to teach their kids to hope in God, right? Prayerfully consider how you can serve both our church family and non-believers by teaching others to know and trust in God. You know, that's what evangelism is. You're teaching them about God. You're teaching them about the wonder of God and His might and His preeminence. And you're trying to teach them that His word is reliable and trustworthy. That's what you're doing. That's what evangelism is. And that you can trust about the good news of Jesus. So be thinking about those things. And hopefully, as we kind of wrap up this morning, go back and read Psalm 78. As Asaph reminds the Israelites of their history with God, there's a warning and a blessing in there. The warning is, hey, don't do what those folks did, but instead choose to believe and to trust and obey. And remember how much God has done for you and be grateful. Well, that's appropriate for the week. Be thinking back on your life with God and how He has been working in your life and how He has been speaking to you through His word, and be grateful, right? And if you're not yet a Christian, if you haven't yet put your hope and trust in God through Christ, you can do that this morning. You can become a Christian and be baptized into Christ and be added to His family, to His kingdom today. And if you're already a Christian and you're trying to figure out, hey, how can I do this better, and you need some help figuring out how to do this better, or what opportunities there might be to serve here, we'd like to talk with you about that and encourage you with that. Whatever your need is after we've been looking through this psalm, let us know by coming forward as we stand and sing.